Today we would be deliberating on the second orbit, second phase or second aspect of the overall method which I call violin. VIOLION. Variant, invariant, orbit, linkage, intentionality, network. That is called a violin. So that anyway will come at the end of it. Variant and invariant, we had some exposure before. I suppose both of them are relatively easy terms. What is the concept sense of variant?
Something that is variable.
Yeah. And the concept sense of invariant?
Uh,
The core that cannot be
or
changed.
The core cannot be added there. That cannot be varied is an invariant, which can be core most of the time.
Okay.
All right. Or rather, you are right in the sense that that invariant
because
is likely to be the core of any of the things, any of the entities, any of the events, any of the phenomena. We deliberated on on a cup as a variant, a pen as a variant, okay? Anything in the environment, rather any referent, and mean any item, anything, any aspect, any attribute is a variant. Even a subatomic particle is a variant because the particle varies from its particle state to wave state and then back to particle state. What could be the invariant of, if you can guess, of a subatomic particle? If subatomic particle is a variant which varies from particle state to wave state, what could be the invariant there? Okay, reflect on that. If every tree, if 1 million mango trees, every mango tree is a variant of a certain brand, a certain kind of mango tree, Alfonso or whatever. What is the invariant of a mango tree? Of that type, which are good for maybe looking at the leaves of that variety most of the time, maybe looking at the texture of the trunk or the bark of the tree. That takes the role of the invariant for the time being when a farmer looks at a mango tree to identify that the invariant of a human entity. Is it any of the manifested outcome? That day when we discussed about invariant of the human entity, Aniratha mentioned about having two eyes. Of course, having two eyes, nose, etc., etc., etc. They're all invariant conditions that define a human entity. But if you look, so-called two eyes would look different from one set of two eyes to the other set of two eyes. They're all variants. So, what is the invariant of the human entity? That is perhaps what the rishis and the other philosophers and mystics identified as the Atman or the soul or the psyche. I mean, we're just wondering about all these things so that you would understand the variant and the invariant. But if you look at an event as just one variant, can there be an invariant? Can you identify the invariant of a single event? Can you identify the invariant idea of a single book or a paragraph or a chapter? Or, for example, what is the invariant of the several variations of that parable, the master woodcutter? What is the invariant there? Here you have to slightly vary the concept of invariant itself, like what Meenakshi said. What is the core of the what you call the parable of the master thief? Sorry, master woodcutter. What is the core? Okay, though you can change the word so that you can get a better comfort of focusing your attention or your reflection or your thinking. Because the concept of invariant or the concept sense of invariant may not be that easily amenable to understand the core of the parable of the master woodcutter. So you can change the word invariant to the core, or that's something which is the central, which is likely to be the core, or which we call as the invariant. So what is the invariant or the core of the parable of the master woodcutter? Or is there only a single core, or can there be more than one core, or three cores, or three invariants in the master woodcutter, or more than three invariants? Okay, how the flexibility? What are the relatively invariant aspects in the master woodcutter? Ganesh, do you know the parable of the master woodcutter? Yeah, all right. So, what are the relatively invariant aspects or states or elements or components in that parable, the master woodcutter?
I think Satori is one, sir.
I think Satori is the core, right? Perhaps the core invariant.
Hmm.
Yeah, the entire parable was sort of devised, designed, and set, and the processes of that parable were mentioned only to come to the core of Satori. Yeah.
I think it is the attention of the woodcutter to the task he had chosen.
Once again,
I think the core of that parable, Master Woodcutter, is the complete attention the Master Woodcutter gave to his task of cutting wood. Because from that
okay,
complete,
okay, 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 okay. Now the question is, every time the master woodcutter cut a tree, he did it with completeness and correctness and firmness of
yes,
attention.
yes.
With the
And
point.
even, yeah, but
That is
even
a
when,
that is an invariant characteristic of the master woodcutter. But if you
okay,
look at that parable, perhaps Satori is the invariant or the core.
but okay, so my thinking is even when Satori bothered him and troubled him and scratched him, he continued to pay attention to the cutting of wood.
All right, Meenakshi. In that sense, you are identifying an invariant attribute of the master woodcutter. Agreed.
You are asking about the parable. Okay,
Yeah.
understood. Now I see the difference.
Yeah, that's
Yes.
all. So,
So, sir,
yeah.
question.
Hmm.
The invariant of any parable, would it not be the purpose of the parable?
Uh, in a way, yes. But there can be one or two, three invariants. With, as you said, there can be a principal focus on one invariant, and there could be sub invariants also. Invariant meaning that which is relatively stable, that which is relatively integrated, that which is relatively ultimate or permanent, relatively stable and consistent in an aspect. But for example, if you look at the parable of the master cook, with every character in the parable, You can identify that invariant aspects for the characters in the parable. You can identify the invariant of the various practices, like the practice of the sword in the parable. You can see that invariant inspiration of the cook, despite all the challenges and great risks involved, his inspiration remained invariant till the last moment. Maybe that invariant inspiration got a slight wavering only when he was challenged at the end by the shogun. It was only a slight variant happened to that invariant. That's why the master samurai could easily trigger him back by the statement, you go back. Okay? Then the invariantness of the shogun. So that relative invariant, do not follow this method in a mechanical way. The purpose is The purpose of this method is to identify the relatively stable, relatively central points which control the subsequent or satellite points in a thing or in a situation or in a context or in a phenomenon. Ganesh. All right. By chance, in a certain problem in your organization, there could be a central only one invariant also in an organization situation or in a creative decision making. There could be only one invariant. That's possible. Like there should be minimum three spokes for a wheel. We can say each one of those spokes is an invariant requirement for a wheel to have its integrity and stability. And at the same time, like Ganesh pointed out, having a hole at the center of the wheel is the ultimate invariant. Because without that hole, entire hub and spoke and the rim are of no use. So for a wheel, let us say that hole in the center is an invariant condition. For example, single invariant. But at the same time, because this having many three spokes is an invariant condition for any wheel to be a wheel. That is that need not be mentioned there because that makes a wheel a wheel. But the design and setting of the spokes can be different from one wheel to the other. No, these are all not hard and fast rules. What is this variant invariant framework? It is only to guide and direct and freely drive your engines of attention and reflection and thinking and conception to understand the situation or an event or a design or a process or a context. That's all. It is not like a what you call micrometer or a telescope. Sorry, or a chronometer. No, not at all. This is a gentle guide to work behind in your programs of intellect so that you will quickly understand the essence of a situation. That's all. That's all. Get the point, Anuradha. For example, this is what helped, for example, our Jagan. When he was the southern region head of Mahindra way back, then Mahindra was planning for globalization and they contracted McKinsey and some 20, 30, 40 people at varied times charging about 8 crore at that point of time. So they did some 8 or 9 months of study and then they were to submit the final report to Keshav Mahindra, Anand Mahindra and four other vice presidents of the company. The meeting was held in Centaur Hotel in Mumbai. And of course, Jagan was also a member because he was especially the southern region manager of Mahindra Tractors. And as usual, he was sitting in the backmost row. And the McKinsey Asia director had come to make the presentation. And about 43 minutes of presentation. And as usual, there was a question, any comments? No comments. Somebody said something that Jagan did not remember. But Jagan had a small notebook in which he had written some 32 or 33 points. And he said he had something to say, and he read out all those points, and the entire audience turned their chairs back towards him. And Keshav Mahindra told him, "Come to my room in the evening." For example, if McKinsey said they would start their first offshore branch or office in some location in South Africa, he suggested it should start in New Zealand. This only I remember after his dialogues. So what I'm telling is, and he was given the charge, and then Keshav Mahindra asked him, "Okay, it is," and he convinced them, and he asked him, "Okay, can you go and do it in New Zealand?" He said yes. And he went to New Zealand and he started the unit there, from there, and so on and so forth. So what I'm telling is, she openly told me that at that time I realized the power of variant invariant perspective. So that's all, which will come to your help also, no doubt about that. So this much is about variant and invariant as a what you call mm, revision. Of course, every day you can see your expressions, your responses, your behaviors, your actions, your ways of relationships, your ways of language. They're all terrible variants. Every time, whenever you get that free time, lonely time, you can perhaps try your attention to locate what is that invariant behind all my expressions. What are those invariant movements of my body? What is that invariant in that continuous variation of thoughts inside me, which is sometimes disturbing, sometimes very, very attractive? And what is Satori? Finally locating that core invariant of you, and all the other manifestations or variations of the expressions, like several cups of the same invariant of a cupness. There are hundreds of different designs and settings of cups. So, and that's all a different question that you can try sometime later when you try. And when you make a presentation or when you try to understand a problem situation in your work, especially, you try to look at that same problem from the framework of variant invariant relationship or variant invariant design and structure and process. Because invariant only is guiding the process of variations. So, from that concept of variant, you have to also understand that universal truth of variation. Everything is varying. Every manifested aspect is a variation of some possible probable invariant. That invariant we may not be able to precisely identify, but there must be an invariant. That's why our sensitivities are able to differentiate one kind of variance from other kind of variance. We can easily identify a cup from among the millions of things heaped in a football ground. And finally, as I always told you, every one of us is a variation of the cup. And if that includes an invariant, of course, possibly in the design of the universal process, and that invariantness is definitely present in the U2, which I call the double, actually. All right. Go on developing metaphors and examples like what I have done. Okay. Everything that you see around you, your headphones, your pencil, your laptop, your keyboard, your tablecloth, your floor, the cupboard, the table lamp, the fan, everything around is nothing but a variant of its class, of its category. Existence is nothing but variations. Every cell of your body is continuously operating, varying. The lung movements are varying. A rhythmic variation of the movement of lungs, rhythmic variation of the heart, rhythmic movements of the villi of the small intestine. So, what is that invariant which is driving all these variations by which existence is possible? So, define and try to see as much as possible whenever you are free. See, to make an analytical dissection of the variant, invariant, the structure and design and setting and the process derived, driven by them. And take a small, every assembly for the last 15 minutes I have been talking about variance and invariance. Varied sentences I talked, varied examples I provided. They were all guided by a singular momentary perception that I have about that truth called variance and invariance. Got it, Meenakshi? Like you have a moment of
Yes.
glimpse of a beautiful girl in the corner of a temple. A split second is the split second mental impression is giving rise to immense variations of thoughts and images and visuals, driving dreams and aspirations.
True.
If you really look into you, you will see that your 1 minute of dialogues, or 2 minutes of dialogues, or 5 minutes of dialogues, or 50 minutes of dialogues are all basically about just one invariant only.
Hmm.
For example, you have a momentary perception about a certain defect in the work of a colleague. You will talk 3, 4, 5 sentences. Or you have a momentary disgruntlement with your colleague or your close friend. A moment, a momentary perception that she lied to you or he lied to you. That happened as it was a momentary perception. But that momentary perception has generated so many variations of ideas and thoughts and perceptions about which we are talking for hours together, maybe days together, maybe years together in infrequent locations of time and space. Basically, that's why it is called, what you call that Zen masters, they don't have anything to talk. Because you want to talk about a momentary perception, next moment that very momentary perception does not exist. It is carried in the mind only. That's why we talk about being in the present. So always understand that. N number of conflicts and conflicting interpersonal relationships have been driven by 1 minute or one moment or one observation. Yeah, she lied to me, or she cheated me, or he cheated me. It happened at that moment actually, but our responses to that for 5 minutes or 5 hours or 10 minutes, that only reinforces that into an invariant state in the mind of both the parties. Get the point? And those invariants in the mind, for example, in the mind of the husband and in the mind of the wife, that invariant is established, okay? And that invariant is generating continuity of whatever emotions, continuity of state of minds and thoughts and perceptions and response patterns and behaviors and relationship modalities and languages. But that moment is already over 15 years back. So I just give another therapeutic implication. Like Veena Ganesh must be experiencing with every client. something happened. And that something had such a mental impression that that something remains as an invariant, and it continuously generating all kinds of obsessions and compulsions and emotional variations. Get the point? So that is the essence of creativity therapy. Creativity therapists provide variations of other thoughts and perceptions and ideas, which when developed will shake the stability of that invariant perception. Navin, get the point?
Yes, sir.
Sir, I have a question.
Yeah.
So when you talked about one invariant perception being created by an incident and that creating several variations in the relationship between two people, I'm asking from a therapeutic perspective, there could also be one invariant that keeps the relationship together despite the many variations that have happened across the years.
Yeah, of course. That was the tradition and culture, for example, of India, maybe in the last century. That's why the act of wedding was created with such a paraphernalia.
True.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That
now
was
all that
been
makes so much sense.
yeah, that has been glorified and deified almost.
Hmm.
Yeah. There's a huge homum being conducted. A
We
whole
lost
lot
that
of
invariant.
mantrams respected at that time, of course, especially respected and glorified. The Pujari is coming, and he is doing all the pujas on behalf of a deity with all the linkages. We are coming to that. All the linkages of the mantras, the linkages of the deity, linkages of the pujas and the homams being done, ghee and plash, and there are certain particular kind of what you call wooden pieces which are specifically used for that homam. And even the homa kundam is made according to certain minimum tantric so-called design. And then mantra japa is done. It takes about 2 to 3 hours to 4 hours, in fact. And such a glorification, such a mysterious linkaging is done so to establish that invariant, so that it becomes an invariant which is powerful enough to manage any turbulence of variations.
Yeah, but the
Yes, sir.
two individuals can also choose to get married because of an invariant, and that stays despite all the differences they have in their lives.
Yeah, of
I have
course.
seen that in my life.
Of course, that's also possible. That's also definitely possible. It is the invariantness of the inspiration of Edmund Hillary at the age of 24, which he carried for about 18 years and practiced in the Mount of Alps, and finally he came into Nepal and tried to climb the Mount Everest. It is an invariant perception. There's a lot to talk about variant invariant relationship. Variant invariant linkages. That momentary doubt why a thing should fall, that had such a powerful force of invariantness that consistently drove him. Like I told you, I see a beautiful girl as a single glance in a crowded temple, and I am in search of that girl, for example. It's a minor event. So it all depends on the quality of the person, the quality or the degree of invariantness, rather unshakableness happen to that moment of truth or moment of decision or moment of action or an event.
Sir, the very fact that we all are here now is also because of a moment like that.
Of course, definitely. Managing so many variations and varied conditions and varied interfaces that are against and maybe for also rarely, you're able to depend on that invariant perception about some value of the kind of insights and perspectives and competences you may develop out of this program. or just the feeling of having that enjoyment of a good discussion of a satsanga. Yes, of course, good ongoing example, correct.
It's a trigger that, or the seed that was planted somewhere,
Of course,
just
of course.
seeking its growth.
And as we mentioned the other day, it is that invariant perception that happens first. Before the first cup, it was an invariant perception of the possibility of a certain shape and design and setting that can contain a liquid. And every cup is a kind of an attempt of the designer to give shape to that invariant perception. That's why often a great craftsman says, I am yet to make a masterpiece. So now we come to the second aspect of that framework. Primarily, I told you this is what we are discussing or beginning to discuss is a framework to look at the world, including the world of ideas and the world of events and episodes and phenomena and things. It's a way to look at the reference. And of course, it can be used to look at just concepts also, paragraphs and books also. But we are not that interested in that. Like invariant and its varied invariant cannot be perceived in general, because invariant is manifested in every variant. It can be sort of grasped. Like what is the cupness of a cup? You can grasp it. Is it in the shape? Is it in the brim? Is it in the handle? Is it in the material? All together. But none of this either. But there is, like the famous axiom, the whole, WHOLE, whole is more than the sum of the parts. Let us say you systematically break a cup into so many pieces. Individual pieces are there, and uh, none of the properties of the individual pieces is
Yes,
having a
exactly.
decisive role in the final form of that individual cup itself. Or rather, none of those pieces can ever do that. Every one of them joined together only formed the cup. See the beauty, see the mystery. Rather, the linkages of that pieces, the way they got linkaged to form whatever at the end. That was made the critical role, critical function. Now we are gradually entering into the phenomenon or the entering into the third universal truth called uh, linkaging or linkages or connectedness. Connectedness is a universal invariant. A truth is an invariant. The other day, myself and Veena had a discussion on what is the truth. What is truth of things? Truth is nothing but invariant. Every variant also is a partial truth, like a presence of a knife, presence of a chapel, presence of a blood-stained clothes. All these are important. But by the linkaging of this, without any missing linkages, only become the evidence for the crime. Only will prove these are all individual evidences. Only these evidences will prove the invariant or the truth of the crime. And that is in the context of crime. That is in the context of every crime, in the sense that every major event, whether the event is positive also, whether the event is that event of a marriage or a decision making or a critical client meeting or a critical design, wherever. So the third universal truth or the third invariant of the universe that is named linkage, using the English word linkage. What is the concept sense of linkage? So by the way, going back, what is the referent of variant? I had told you many times that concept sense is okay. When you have to talk about the referent, you have to take a given referent, anything. So the pen in the hands of Anuradha is a referent of a variant because it is one of the millions of pens. A varied item of anything is a referent of the variant. Anuradha, what are you wondering? Because referent, you have to point out something. Meaning, variant is that which varies. Concept sense of anything, things are undergoing variations and there are so many varied things. So you got a certain sense, an internal sense of the concept of variant. Now, when you talk about the referent or reference, plural, you have to take a, you cannot talk about all the variants of pens in the world. Impossible. So you take one pen or one chair or one laptop or one spectacles. And then that is the referent of variant. That's all. So you have to always take an example, an item. That's a referent of variant. And then you can talk. And in order to talk about the given referent of a pen, you can talk. You can bring in maybe other pen and you say this clip is like this, the other clip is like that, this color is like this, the other color is like that, shape of this is this, shape of that is that. And if there are two identical pens brought on the same day, opened from the packet, you say one pen is in my right hand and the other pen is in my left hand. That's enough. Varied. Or pen number one I took first, pen number two I took second. Finished. Variants. Pen number one is placed on spot A of the table, and on that spot A you cannot place pen number two. Finished. In the space of planet Earth, you cannot put two things at identical space. Therefore, two identical things are also in principle variants because of the simple reason that item number two occupies a different space of the planet Earth, or at least on a tabletop. Finished. That should be the accuracy of the sword of clarity. In that case. Alright. Alright. So, linkage, you got more or less the concept sense. Can you talk about can you give examples of the reference of, or referent of linkages or linkage? Alright. Linkage or connectedness. Because in order to have linkage, there must be definitely what is the invariant condition of having linkage? Ganesh.
Have to be multiple things, sir.
At least.
At least two things.
Yes, that's all. Finished. The concept of linkage is possible. At least the invariant condition for linkage to exist is minimum two things. at its two sides, that is a single subatomic particle. But with so-called subatomic or quantum physics talk about particle becoming wave, and that wave comes back to particle. Here, actually, I have an observation, which I don't think any quantum physicist has pointed out till today. That is, entire quantum physics says that the same subatomic particle, a given subatomic particle varies into a wave and comes back to particle. Because particles can never be really observed, what is the guarantee that that particular wave is coming back to that particular particle? Anyway, that is my question to the entire world of quantum physics. Let it be there, finished. Okay, coming back, because how can I say this is because I understand the universal truth of variation. If variation is a universal truth, a given particle at time 1 shifts into wave, time 2, time 3, it comes back to particle. I am sure particle number 1 and particle number 2, there is a slight difference, no doubt. I must get a Nobel Prize for this, but I cannot prove it. Forget about that, just a joke. Anyway, coming back, if Ramesh can work out on that, or Asadi, or somebody can work out on that, do it. But we don't have the tools of experimenting bubble chamber and things like that. But even this idea is worthwhile for somebody to do that. Coming back to the point, what is the uh, give give example of a referent of
Two sides of a
linkage?
coin.
Yeah,
Two sides of a coin.
that's also at the rudimentary level. Particle wave translation is absolutely rudimentary. Equally rudimentary is the head and the tail side of a coin. Why it is very rudimentary? Why it is the primary? So, what is the linkage? In which way tail is linkaged to the head of a coin?
The existence of one automatically gives the existence of the other.
Once again,
The existence of one automatically generates the existence of the other
because of what?
because of the very nature of existence.
No,
So
no, that's true. Because of what attribute of that so-called coin?
The design of the coin.
Huh?
yeah,
Design.
faces.
If it is the design of a sheet,
Then
a
also
square sheet,
it has two sides.
Two
yeah.
sides.
Then also.
Basically, the one side, let us coin has a different design of the head and different design for the tail. Let us say uniform piece of carbon, or I don't know, a piece of, let's say, gold, a thin foil of gold. One side is not the other side. Why? Or rather, now we are mixing, we are connecting variant, invariant, and linkage. One side of the gold sheet, thin sheet, is varied from the other side of the same sheet.
Because it exists in
But
three-dimensional space.
these two sides have a definite linkage.
It exists in three-dimensional
First of,
space.
let us wait for one side is definitely a variant from the other side. Why? Yeah, what is that, Veena?
It exists in three-dimensional space.
And that's a contextual linkage you are bringing in. If it was not existing in a three-dimensional space, do you mean to say that both the sides are identical, or both the sides are the same invariant? The sheet is invariant.
The
But the
direction it
sides
faces.
are
Both the sides are facing
go.
different directions.
Yeah, the directions are different. Directions are impossible to be seen. When we say this, what all interpretations do you make now? I'm changing the direction of the question.
So for every point of view, there is an opposing point of view available already.
Interpretation number one. This alone, if the world understands, in fact, a great amount of conflicts can be simply made null, in vain. Because as far as I know, gold is a malleable material which can be made the thinnest sheet. Okay,
Yes, sir.
it has two variations or variants of sides, and there, though they may look in all chemical microscopic analysis, they may individually look alike. They are still variants because both of them inevitably face two directions, which implies that a given thing will have two directions, even if it is a so-called God. And they are declaring that there is only one singular God. For example,
Because one side is oblivious to the other side.
exactly. And for a thin gold sheet, are there only two sides?
No.
Yeah. Howsoever thin, there is at
Similar.
least a nano whatever of the side also. There comes our principle of three again. So there cannot be one, there cannot be two, and there can only be three in the very universe. What other proof is required? Good. Now another question. What is the linkage between side 1, side 2 and side 3? Let us say side A, side B and side C. Alright. What is that linkage? They are definitely linkaged, physically linkaged.
Yeah.
We are beginning with the physical linkage as a primary zero orbit beginning. Then we will go to remote linkages. That's at a later point of time. But for the systematic development of understanding of variance, invariance, and linkage, just a round gold coin. Three variant sides.
So side one. So
Hmm.
side one in a gold coin is circular. So on that circumference is where the side two, which is on the circumference on the perimeter, it sits is a side two. Side three is again which is opposite to side one, which sits on the side two,
Beautiful.
facing opposite direction. So
Beautiful.
one is facing one direction, the other is facing opposite direction. The in between side two is facing radially.
Yeah. All right. Ramesh can perhaps make a graphical representation of that. Okay. Now, before we go into further details, what are the implications? I suppose Ramesh can describe it once again. Rather, one variant is linkaged to the second variant through the circumference, through the brim. And that variant, number two, of the same invariant is linked to the third variant again by another circumference. All right? Now, why don't you try to interpret this?
Even if there are opposing views, there is always possibility to find common ground.
Ganesh, talk a little more slowly because this is to be recorded.
Okay, sorry. So I said, even though there are opposing points of view, they are linkage with a common ground. So it is possible to find a common linkage between the two opposing views.
Exactly. Yeah, let us say interpretation one. There should be at least two more numbers. In other words, even when the directions or positioning of aspects or entities or characteristics or events or episodes or phenomena are seemingly diametrically opposite, there must be one thing at least, okay, Ganesh, that is intimately, not tentatively, linkaging the so-called three opponent dimensions. See? Get the point, Ashwati? Yeah. Ameya, Rajarishi, Mandra, Rishiga.
Yes.
Yeah. This has also implications. Now, Ganesh identified the core invariant condition. From this, what more interpretations are possible?
All the three are part of the same thing. All the three sides are part of the same coin. Similarly,
Yeah, that is of course a point, Nitya. But in normal distribution existence of people, they are not clear what is that central thing. You know, we are having an example of one single coin or a single sheet of identical material, and we are talking only about the sides. Those who are taking the sides of opposite nature, they are not aware of that thing which about which they are taking the opposite sides. You know now that it is a single coin of uniform material. But the three opposing groups, minimum three opposing groups, they are not clear about the so-called sides which they are taking to fight each other. When the Islamic perspective talk about Allah is the God and Allah is the only one God, they do not understand what is God. When the Christian perspective is talking about Yahweh is the God and Yahweh is the only one God, they don't know what is that coin called God. All right. Any other interpretation which are of a different, of a next level?
At any one point in time, it is not possible to see the whole point in space.
Anuradha, we are having a very major discussion. So talk a little more slowly. Once again.
In any one point in time and space, it is not possible to see the whole.
Okay, you have introduced two concepts there, time and space. Why? Or any moment of time Why do you say that? Because at a given moment of time, one side is only one side. Somebody has to vary the coin itself. Or somebody has to point out the nature of the center thing about which there are three sides. Okay. But what is your point? Or what made you give these points?
When we are seeing something or when we are discussing about something or when you're trying to understand something at one point in time, we'll be able to see only one aspect
All
of
right.
the thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Yeah, that's a good interpretation. Why it is working? Because at second point of time, there is the possibility of variations in space. I mean, variations at least in attention. That's why there are more than 2, 3, 4, 5 so-called negotiations and diplomatic meetings. Yes, 2, 3 negotiations. Or why certain critical issues should be discussed in different time, space, locations. Correct. All right, that's a good point for negotiation, conflict resolution, and so on and so forth. Very true. In training program, it is very effective. I have seen talking certain ideas about, for example, creativity, simple levels of creativity. It works much better in an outside location. I mean, just outside the rooms of a so-called resort. It was much more incredibly unexpected directions if it is in a wild and ambiguous location. And preferably a mysterious location. These are all to be discussed. What you said is to be further discussed, actually. Because even when the center coin, center probe, center aspect, and the three sides remain invariant, invariant in the perception of three different angles of observation. Okay? When the time and space changes, like Ganesh pointed out, the direction, the emanation of energy field from the three directions itself will change and rebound in a different way. Very likely. That's why significant client meetings are held in so-called five-star hotels, upper-class hotels, and so on and so forth. Very correct. All right. Then, any other interpretation?
Sir, the line separating two opposite sides is a very thin line. And
Yeah.
the example I would like to give is one that you always say about a balance, and that one last grain of sugar is sufficient to tip the balance.
That you are bringing in a totally different process setting design. Okay, we will come to that little later. That's a much higher order example suddenly you are putting it. Now actually you are talking about something invariant itself. Like like the so-called seemingly invariant concepts and conceptions about God, or an invariant piece of plate or a coin. All right. Now, about processes and events and all, it is much more complex. We will come to that little bit later. Okay. Yeah. But can you talk about the same in case of a coin? It is actually, yeah, the turning point from one side to the next is very thin. But it has, it encompasses a whole lot of things. It is the entire diameter of the coin, for example. But how do you see that point of linkage of the opposite sides of 1, 2, and 3 are, though very mild, though very thin, like you said, but at the same time, they're somehow or the other having linkage to every element of the whole field of a plane, Ramesh. Because that circumference is connected in principle, or it encompasses the whole issue of one side. But as you said, Ashwati, it is very thin, therefore it may require very sharp language and creative control of concepts for the negotiator to make the sides to understand it. That's so. That is true. Because it is very thin. And that thin element is present everywhere. Entire circumference, Anuradha. No? But because it is thin, the parties involved will always object to that, always pretend that they don't see that thin turning point. That's the problem. For example, the Islam people are also praying in a contained space. Christian people are also going and praying in the contained space. Hindus are also doing the same thing. For example, the activities, the level of attentions, or the focus of attention, or the element of dedication, or the intentionality involved are all common. I want to get out of suffering. Let us say that intentionality is quite common. You feel hungry and you go and take a biryani, and I feel hungry and I take some kanji, and I say kanji is greater than biryani. That is what is going on. The hunger or that instinctive intentionality to connect with something beyond all this thing is the common hunger for everyone. But someone says that biryani is the only correct food. They don't see these margins. The connection is very marginal. They claim that if you take biryani, your hunger will be much more resolved than if you take kanji. Or this side is greater than the other side. Because they don't come and take kanji and realize that kanji also fulfills the need of hunger. That the taste of biryani ends up at the tongue.